Today I want to draw your attention to the parallels of abusive tactics within abusive relationships and how abusive the political system is. We all know by now how abusers behave. It's common knowledge of the tactics that abusers use. I'm just going to ask you to consider political parties and their broadcasts, their propaganda, their social media campaigns, how they behave when they're on the news, and just consider if they have any of these traits. Okay, so abusive relationships begin with an abuser deciding on the type of victim they want to go for. So some abusers like a challenge. And so they look for people who are very confident, people with status, people with power, and they're the people that they choose to abuse. But it's more common that abusers look for vulnerable people. So they look for easy prey. So they're looking for people who will buy into their lies that they tell at the start to hoover the person they've chosen as the victim into their abuse dynamics. So now consider what happens with political parties. They decide on a demographic, an audience type, and that is who they position as who they want to draw in. So that's one parallel. Next, the abuser goes on a fact-finding mission. And they do these fact-finding missions to work out what is their victim's weaknesses, fears, doubts, insecurities, what are their beliefs, what things do they need to destabilize within the victim so that they'll be easier to control. And now I want you to consider what happens with politicians and their broadcasts. Generally, they are picking on their demographics' fears, and they are exaggerating them in order to draw that demographic in. In other words, to draw their victim in. So that's another parallel. Then there's love bombing. So abusers, when they find their victim, they want to make their victim feel special. Because if the victim feels special, they're less likely to question the abuse tactics. So now I want you to consider what happens with political parties, their broadcasts, etc. It's all about their love for their demographic, and how they care so deeply for their demographic and how special their demographic is. And that's to draw in the demographic, in other words, their victims, and to stop them from questioning them. Then I want you to think about what happens next in an abusive relationship. The person who is the victim gets placed on a pedestal at first. They are special, they are wonderful, they're the answer to the abuser's prayers. And that's how they get built up and built up and built up. Now I want you to think about political parties with their broadcasts and think about how they build up how their demographic is the right. They're the ones in the right. They're the morally good ones. And so there you have another parallel. Then eventually something happens and the abuser decides they're not the answer to my prayers and I'm going to start devaluing them. But before I do that, I better isolate them so they can't leave this abusive relationship. So now I want you to consider what happens with political parties, with their broadcasts. They begin to isolate their demographic. Them and us, divide and conquer. It's this group of people who are the problem, and we've all got to be really aware of them, because if we're not aware of them and we're not going to go after them, then we're not going to be safe. In other words, they start to isolate their demographic, the same way an abuser isolates their victim. So then we move on to what happens with the abuser when they start future faking. And future faking is just when they tell lies about the future that they've no intention of keeping. And I want you to think about political parties, their broadcasts, and think about how it never happens, does it? Every single one of them, what they tell you is going to happen, what they're going to do for us, it actually just doesn't happen. Because they're future faking, they're promising you things that they can't promise. And so they're making you false promises that they can't keep, because that keeps you hooked into the dynamic, keeps you believing them, keeps you feeding their ego, and eventually they'll let you down big time, the same way an abuser does. And so I really want you to just consider how political parties or the political system is built on manipulation and abuse tactics. And then I want you to consider who you are more drawn to in terms of political parties. And I want you to consider how many of those tactics they're using. That is the system, and the system is abusive. So I'm saying this, and I hope that it frees you today from the abusive system.